I had always believed that anniversaries were not just dates on a calendar, but milestones carved into the map of a relationship, markers that told us how far we had come and how much we had endured together. When my fiancé suggested we take a trip to celebrate our anniversary, I clung to that gesture as proof that maybe, just maybe, the two of us still shared the same dreams. I poured myself into the planning, ensuring every detail was curated with care. The reservations at a resort we had once admired from afar, the dinners I knew he would love, the little surprises I tucked into the corners of our schedule to remind him of our earliest days together. To me, this trip was a love letter written in motion, a declaration that despite the challenges we had faced, there was still something worth celebrating. As we packed our bags, I remember looking at him with a tenderness that almost embarrassed me. I knew we had drifted in ways I couldn't fully articulate, but I thought distance was inevitable in any long relationship, something to be managed rather than feared. He seemed distracted as he folded his clothes into his suitcase, his eyes scanning his phone between movements, but I told myself not to take it personally. Work was always demanding, and he had always been a man who balanced too many things at once. I dismissed the unease that crept in at the edges of my optimism, convincing myself that this trip would restore what had begun to feel fragile between us. The journey itself was filled with moments that seemed ordinary at first glance, but, in hindsight, carried a heaviness I couldn't see then. On the plane, he leaned into the window seat, scrolling endlessly, while I stared at the horizon, imagining the dinners by candlelight, the walks along the beach, the quiet laughter I thought we might rediscover. When we landed, the resort greeted us with its polished smiles and soft music, the kind of environment that promised intimacy, even if you arrived with doubt. I held his hand as we checked in, but his grip was loose, perfunctory, as though the gesture were for appearances rather than instinct. I had prepared something special for our first evening, a dinner at the terrace overlooking the sea. I wore a dress he once said made me look like sunlight walking, a phrase that had stayed with me through the years, because it was one of the rare times he had spoken without calculation. I wanted him to look at me that way again. As we sat down, I poured wine into his glass and thought about how far we had come since those first fumbling months, how many sacrifices I had made to build this life with him. The conversation was polite, fragmented, with long pauses where I filled the silence with stories about places I wanted us to see, things I wanted us to try. He nodded, sometimes smiled, but I could sense his mind was elsewhere, orbiting around something unsaid. Still, I told myself that the trip itself was the gesture, that I shouldn't expect fireworks in every moment. Relationships grow quiet, I reasoned, and perhaps my role was to reignite what had dulled. I looked around at the other couples, some laughing easily, some content in their silence, and I envied them for what they seemed to share without effort. I wondered when love had started to feel like work for us, but I quickly brushed the thought aside. This trip was supposed to be the reset, the memory that would remind us why we were still walking together. What I didn't know was that beneath the polished surface of this anniversary, something corrosive was waiting to reveal itself. I couldn't have known that the trip I had dreamed of, planned with all my devotion, would instead become the stage for a revelation so sharp it would split everything we had built in two. But in those first hours, before the words that would shatter me were spoken, I believed wholeheartedly that we were here because he wanted to be, because this was still our story, and because anniversaries meant something to him the way they meant everything to me. I clung to that hope like a child holding onto the edge of a raft, blind to the waves already forming just beyond the horizon. The air smelled of salt and citrus that night, and the candles flickered in the breeze as if conspiring with the silence he carried. I smiled, lifted my glass and whispered, "Here's to us," unaware that within hours, those words would lose all their meaning. For now, in my mind, the trip was still a sanctuary, a fragile attempt at reclaiming love. And because I wanted to believe in us more than I wanted to believe in the truth, I ignored every shadow that had already started to stretch across the light. The second evening of our anniversary trip arrived with the kind of effortless beauty that should have made everything else irrelevant. The sun had folded itself into the horizon, leaving streaks of amber and violet across the water, and the air was warm but not heavy, the kind of night that seemed tailored for intimacy. We had spent the day meandering through local streets lined with small shops and cafes, the kind of leisurely exploration that often fills a relationship with new threads of memory. Yet even as I tried to weave those threads together, I could sense his detachment. He walked beside me, his hand brushing mine occasionally, but it felt more like obligation than desire, as though his presence was a performance he no longer cared to perfect. I ignored the weight of that impression, pushing it aside with the stubbornness of someone who refuses to admit what they already suspect. By the time we returned to the resort, I convinced myself that dinner would change everything. I had arranged a table by the sea again, thinking the sound of the waves would soften whatever tension lingered between us. He looked impeccable in his pressed shirt and tailored jacket, the kind of image that made strangers admire him. And for a fleeting second, I remembered why I had once fallen so hard, why I had built years of my life around this man. The waiter poured our wine, and I clinked my glass lightly against his, offering a smile that sought to bridge the distance between us. He raised his glass too, but his eyes remained elsewhere, somewhere I could not follow, as if even in that moment he was a guest in my company, rather than a partner. The conversation began in fragments, my questions answered with monosyllables, his attention wandering toward his phone more than toward me. I asked about his work, the projects he had spoken of with such ambition, and he responded with a vague shrug, his mind clearly engaged in something more pressing, something not meant to be shared. I tried to fill the silence with lighter stories, memories of our first trip together when we were still learning each other's rhythms, but the words seemed to fall flat, scattered like petals on the ground, unnoticed and unvalued. That was when it happened, with no warning, no build-up, just a sudden rupture in the evening that cut sharper than anything I had ever heard from him. "You're replaceable," he said, his voice calm, almost bored, as though he were commenting on the weather, rather than dismantling the foundation of everything we had. The words landed with the cold precision of a blade. I felt the breath catch in my chest, a strange stillness seeping through me, but I did not flinch. I watched him sip his wine casually, as if the cruelty he had just delivered was a simple fact, an observation of the natural order of things. There was no anger in his tone, no heated argument to frame the insult, just indifference, which made it infinitely worse. I expected tears to form, my voice to break, my body to betray the tremor of humiliation, but instead I felt an uncanny calm, a silence that cloaked me like armor. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile one wears when they have already begun to step back from the fire, and I nodded, as though I had been told something obvious. Inside, however, a fracture was spreading, the years of devotion and sacrifice collapsing under the weight of those two words. Replaceable. As if the night spent waiting for him, the compromises I had made, the dreams I had set aside to support his ambitions, had all been investments with no value. In that instant, I saw him for what he truly was, not the partner I had once believed in, but a man so consumed by his own ego that he mistook cruelty for power. His eyes flickered toward me briefly, perhaps to gauge my reaction, perhaps to see if his words had wounded me, but all he found was composure. That composure was not strength at first. It was shock, the mind's refusal to fully absorb betrayal. But in the stillness it created, something deeper began to stir. A quiet shift, almost imperceptible, that would become the foundation for everything I was about to do. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a surreal play. He continued speaking in half-hearted sentences, unaware that I had already crossed an invisible threshold. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, my mind replaying his words over and over, not as a wound but as a catalyst. The more I turned them over in my thoughts, the more I realized that this was not the beginning of my despair, but the end of my illusions. I had spent so long believing I was indispensable to him, that the sacrifices I had made bound us together, when in truth, he had been preparing me for this moment all along, the moment when he could dismiss me without hesitation, without consequence. But what he did not know, what he could not see, was that I had already learned to live in silence, to plan in quiet shadows. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate slice of cake with fruit arranged in perfect symmetry, I had already begun constructing the framework of my response. I didn't know the exact form it would take yet, but I knew this much. I would not beg. I would not cry. I would not crumble. His words had not reduced me to rubble. They had simply exposed the cracks in a structure I had been holding together alone. I realized then that love without respect is nothing but theater, and he had just torn down the curtain with his own arrogance. We walked back to the room afterward, the night breeze cool against my skin, and I let him speak about trivialities as though nothing had been said. I nodded, smiled occasionally, even brushed my hand against his arm as if still the devoted partner, but inside, a resolve was hardening. He believed I was replaceable. He believed my worth could be measured by his ability to discard me. He had no idea that with one phone call, one document signed, one quiet decision, I could erase the very ground he stood on. As I lay in bed that night beside him, listening to the shallow rhythm of his sleep, I understood the power of silence more than ever. Silence would become my weapon. His phrase, meant to diminish me, had instead unlocked a new clarity, and though he slept soundly, dreaming perhaps of a world where I was already gone, I lay awake with the certainty that the next time he tried to remind me I was replaceable, he would be the one stripped of everything he thought he owned. The morning after he delivered those words, I awoke with a strange clarity that startled me. The ceiling of the resort suite stretched above me, its polished wood beams glowing faintly in the light of dawn, and beside me he lay sprawled, one arm flung carelessly across the bed, his breathing steady and untroubled. To look at him then, so unburdened, one would never guess that the night before he had detonated a truth designed to diminish me, to reduce me to nothing more than a replaceable figure in the theater of his life. I studied the relaxed curve of his mouth, the faint shadow of stubble across his jaw, and wondered how I had ever mistaken this man for someone who could treasure loyalty. That single word, spoken so casually, had undone years of sacrifice, years of dedication, years in which I had poured myself into the role of partner, believer, supporter, and dreamer beside him. As I rose quietly and stepped onto the balcony, the sea stretched vast and unending before me, the waves rolling with a rhythm as ancient as time itself. I clutched the railing and let the salt air sting my face, my chest rising and falling with a calm that felt almost unnatural. My mind replayed fragments of our shared history, me waiting late into the night for him to return from work, the dinners grown cold on the table, the birthdays I organized alone because he was always too busy to plan, the compromises I had made without recognition, the dreams I had shelved because they didn't align with his trajectory. Every memory seemed now to carry a shadow of futility, as though my life had been written in service to a story that he never even bothered to read. I thought back to the first time we met, the effortless charm he exuded, the way his attention felt like a spotlight I had longed for without knowing it. He had spoken to me as though I were singular, irreplaceable, a person worth anchoring his ambitions to, and I had believed him. I wanted to believe that someone could look at me and see not just a companion, but a partner in every sense of the word. And for years, I acted on that belief, shaping my choices around what would be best for us, molding my aspirations to make space for his. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I had taught myself to believe that my worth was tied to his regard, that if he thrived, I would thrive too. It was only now, after the blade of that single word cut me open, that I could see how much of myself had been eroded. Replaceable. The syllables reverberated in my mind, hollow and sharp all at once. I wondered how long he had carried that thought in him before it finally slipped into speech. Had he always believed it, even in the beginning, when he spoke of forever with such conviction? Or had it crept in over time, nurtured by his arrogance, by the attention of others, by the ease with which he believed he could discard loyalty and still land on his feet? I realized it didn't matter. The truth was not in the timing, but in the declaration itself, in his certainty that I was no more than a placeholder in his life. And in that realization, the years I had given him seemed to crumble like paper left out in the rain, soft, fragile, dissolving into nothing. Yet even as grief threatened to surge, I refused to let it consume me. I felt it press against me, an ocean at the edge of breaking through, but I held it back, channeling it instead into something sharper, something steadier. For the first time, I examined my sacrifices, Not with sorrow, but with calculation. Every late night waiting, every dream deferred, every penny saved, every plan bent to accommodate his desires. All of it had given me a ledger I now intended to balance. I was not going to drown in the wasted years. I was going to transform them into ammunition. If he thought I was replaceable, he was about to learn how easily his carefully constructed life could collapse when the person he had underestimated decided to stop carrying the weight he so casually ignored. He stirred in bed behind me, stretching with the groggy entitlement of a man who believes the world will always bend to him. I turned to watch him, my expression unreadable, and it struck me how blind he was to the shift that had already begun. To him, last night's words were just another offhand remark, a dismissal tossed into the air with no thought of consequence. He expected me to absorb it, to file it away in silence, as I had done with so many slights before. He had no idea that in uttering them, he had burned the bridge that kept me tethered to him. As the morning unfolded, I found myself recalling the milestones we had celebrated in the past, each anniversary wrapped in sentimentality and empty promises. The gifts he gave, the words he wrote, the photographs we framed, all of them now seemed fraudulent, artifacts of a theater that had only one true actor. I had been the set piece, the backdrop, the loyal audience to his performance. And with that realization, something hardened inside me, a resolve I had never felt so completely before. The years might have been wasted in the sense that he never truly valued them, but I refused to allow them to be wasted in their entirety. They had shaped me into someone stronger than I realized, someone who could look betrayal in the eye and not crumble. By the time breakfast was served, the plan had already begun to form in the quiet recesses of my mind. I smiled across the table at him, poured coffee into his cup, and let him think that nothing had changed. He spoke of excursions we might take that day, of meetings he needed to arrange once we returned, of trivial details that carried no weight in the shadow of what he had revealed. I nodded, played my part, and in that performance I discovered a new power. He had spent years believing he was the one orchestrating the stage, but now the roles had shifted. The more he dismissed me, the stronger I felt, because I knew what he did not, that I had already begun rewriting the ending to this story. Years erased in a single word, yes, but in their erasure, I found space to carve something new, something unforgiving, something that would ensure he understood the cost of his arrogance. What he had dismissed as replaceable would soon become irreplaceable in the most devastating way, not because he had lost me, but because he would lose everything he believed was untouchable. It is strange how the human heart can be shattered one evening and then, by the time dawn rises again, begin to harden into something unrecognizable. That morning, after he called me replaceable, and slept without a trace of remorse, I felt no desire to plead for answers or wrestle for explanations. Instead, I felt something click inside me, a shift like the snapping of a lock. The years I had wasted in sacrifice had not been wasted entirely, for they had trained me in silence, in observation, in the patience of someone who learns how to bend without breaking. Now those same qualities transformed themselves into weapons. I knew I could no longer rely on emotion, not on the desperate instinct to save what was already broken, but on calculation, measured choices, and the cold logic that had always been my quiet strength. He had shown me what he thought of me, and in response, I decided to show him what I was capable of when stripped of illusion. As we moved through the day, he seemed blissfully unaware of the transformation taking place beside him. We walked hand in hand along streets filled with vendors and colors, and to anyone watching, we looked like a couple wrapped in celebration, marking another milestone of love. But in reality, I was already constructing the framework of an exit that would not only free me from his arrogance, but dismantle the very foundation of the security he thought he controlled. He pointed at jewelry in a window, half joking that I should choose something as an anniversary gift, and I smiled, letting him believe that his offhand comment erased the cruelty of the night before. He had no idea that every step we took was one closer to his unraveling. That evening, while he lounged in the suite, scrolling on his phone and sipping a drink, I excused myself with the softness of routine. "I'll take a bath," I said, but instead I locked the bathroom door, sat on the cold tile floor with my phone in hand, and began the quiet work of realignment. It began with a single call to my attorney, A man who had once warned me gently about the dangers of binding myself too closely to someone whose assets, debts, and ego all blurred together. He answered immediately, his voice calm, steady, and unshaken, even as I whispered that the time had come to move forward with protections we had only discussed hypothetically. He listened without judgment as I explained what had been said, and though I did not let my voice tremble, I knew he heard the iron in it. He reminded me of the steps we had prepared, the accounts held in my name, the joint investments where my signature was required, the financial strings I could cut if I chose. One by one we reviewed them, and I confirmed that each should be secured under my authority. It was not vengeance for its own sake that guided me, but the clarity of self-respect awakened by betrayal. For too long I had believed that loyalty meant endurance, that devotion meant silence, but now I understood that silence could serve a different master. In silence, I could plan. In silence, I could dismantle. And in silence, I could step into a role he never expected of me, the architect of his downfall. He believed he held the keys to our life together, but in truth, I had always been the one who managed the details, who balanced the accounts, who knew where every thread of stability lay. He had mistaken my diligence for dependence, my care for weakness. That blindness was his undoing. When I returned to the room, steam still clinging to my hair as though I had bathed, he looked up briefly, offered a smile that carried none of the warmth it once did, and asked if I felt better. I smiled back, a practiced curve of my lips, and slipped into bed beside him, the phone resting quietly on the nightstand, still warm from the call that had already begun to freeze the assets he thought untouchable. He leaned in to kiss me goodnight, and I let him, though the gesture felt hollow, as though he were pressing his lips against the mask I had put on for him. Inside, I no longer felt like the woman who had once bent herself to fit the contours of his needs. I felt like someone entirely new, someone who would not only leave, but ensure that his arrogance collapsed in the process. The following day, as we walked through the resort's manicured gardens, he spoke casually about a business opportunity he wanted to pursue, one that would require significant capital. He spoke with the same ease as always, assuming that money flowed around him like water, that it would always be there to fund his desires. I nodded, asked polite questions, even offered encouragement, and he smiled at me as though reassured that his place in my life was unshaken. But as he spoke, I imagined the look on his face when he would next attempt to access the wealth he so casually took for granted. The thought did not bring me joy exactly. It brought me calm, a steady kind of justice that felt as inevitable as the tide. That night, I lay awake again, the sound of the ocean crashing against the shore below our balcony, and I replayed the steps I had taken, the doors I had locked behind me. Each detail was in motion, each piece secured, and all that remained was for time to deliver its consequence. He slept as soundly as before, wrapped in the comfort of his ignorance. But beside him, I felt neither anger nor despair. I felt the quiet certainty of someone who had stepped beyond fear. The word he had used to wound me, replaceable, no longer haunted me as it had the night before. Instead, it became a promise, a reminder that when the moment arrived, it would not be I who was replaced, but him, stripped of the illusion that he was the irreplaceable center of everything we shared. By the time dawn painted the sky again, I was no longer the woman who had arrived at this resort clinging to the hope of renewal. I had stepped into a new skin, cold, strategic, deliberate. He would never see the shift until it was too late, until the performance of our love dissolved under the weight of the consequences I had already set in motion. He had called me replaceable, but the irony would soon become unbearable for him. For when the ground beneath him gave way and the walls of his arrogance collapsed, he would learn the truth that had crystallized in me. It was not I who had been replaceable all along. It was him. If there is one thing betrayal makes you see with piercing clarity, it is the details you once dismissed as ordinary. After that night when he said I was replaceable, and after the quiet resolve that took root in me the following morning, I began to notice the subtleties of his arrogance with new eyes, as if someone had wiped a film from the lens through which I viewed him. Every careless gesture, every entitled demand, every assumption that the world bent itself to his convenience, now revealed itself, not as confidence, but as the fragile scaffolding of a man who believed power resided in appearances. And nowhere was this more evident than in the way he treated money, our money, though in truth, much of it had been cultivated, protected, and multiplied by me. He walked through life as if accounts never ran dry, as if credit never expired, as if security was a natural right bestowed upon him rather than the careful labor of someone working silently in the shadows. I had known for years that he was reckless with spending. He loved the flash of new watches, the thrill of expensive cars, the satisfaction of handing over a black card with the smug tilt of his chin. He basked in the envy of others, feeding on their admiration as though each glance confirmed his worth. But what he never seemed to understand was that I was the one who made sure the machinery beneath his extravagance kept functioning. I was the one who paid attention to details. Taxes filed, investments balanced, contracts reviewed, loopholes closed. He had mistaken my diligence for submission, my quiet guardianship of his financial life for dependence on him, when in truth, it was the other way around. Without me, he would have been nothing more than another man drowning in debt, clinging to credit lines like a lifeboat. I remembered with unsettling clarity the early years when we first moved in together. He had a decent job then, but nothing extraordinary, and I was the one who suggested we open joint accounts, not because I needed to, but because I believed transparency was the truest form of trust. I organized our savings, invested in places he never even bothered to ask about, built safety nets he didn't know existed. I thought I was protecting both of us, ensuring we had a future strong enough to weather storms. He never objected, of course. Why would he? It suited him perfectly to let me take care of the invisible burdens while he enjoyed the visible fruits. In his eyes, the money was simply there, always accessible, an endless fountain that required no understanding of its source. On this trip, after the fracture of his cruel words, I noticed how casually he spoke about finances, as though I were not even part of the equation. Over breakfast, he mentioned buying property abroad, his tone one of inevitability, not consultation. Later, he spoke of moving funds into a venture his friend had proposed, one so risky that even on the surface it sounded like a trap, but his confidence in it was absolute. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his drink, eyes glittering with the arrogance of someone convinced that money existed solely to inflate his ego. I watched him, my expression calm, and realized that he had no awareness at all of how dependent he was on me. He thought of himself as the architect of wealth, when in truth he was only the actor performing wealth on a stage I had built. That afternoon, while he napped, I sat on the balcony again with a notebook in my lap, reviewing in my mind the strings that bound him to me financially. There were the investment portfolios in both our names, but structured so that my approval was necessary for any withdrawal above a certain threshold. There were the savings accounts into which I had poured money over the years, each one traceable through my oversight. Even the credit cards he carried, those symbols of his self-importance, were tethered to accounts where I held equal, if not greater, authority. His ignorance was not accidental. It was cultivated. He had never bothered to ask, never bothered to read the fine print, never questioned why everything always worked out smoothly. He assumed it was his due, when in truth, it was my design. And as I sat there, the irony unfolded with exquisite sharpness. He had called me replaceable, but his entire financial existence was built on my irreplaceable attention. He had mocked me with a word, but in doing so, he had exposed the blind spot that would become his ruin. I knew now, with absolute certainty, that he could not survive the removal of my hand from the machinery. If I withdrew, if I tightened the valves and locked the doors, the entire edifice of his arrogance would collapse in on itself. He would stumble into humiliation not because I screamed or cried or exposed his betrayal with fury, but because when he reached for the resources that had always been there, they would no longer answer to him. That evening, as we dressed for dinner, he spoke again about the future, about cars he intended to buy, trips he intended to take, ventures he intended to fund. His voice carried that same careless confidence, and I listened with a serene patience that must have looked like devotion. But beneath the mask, I was already setting the sequence into place. I was already imagining the exact moment when he would try to pay a bill, pull out his gleaming card, and faced not admiration but the humiliation of a decline. I could see the flush rising in his cheeks, the scramble of excuses, the way his charm would fracture under the weight of panic. And the beauty of it was that he would not even realize, until it was too late, that the hands tightening around his financial arrogance were mine. As he adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror, he looked over his shoulder at me and smirked, saying, "You'll always be taken care of, don't worry." It was the kind of remark he believed would comfort me, a careless assurance that implied I was dependent on him for stability. I smiled softly in response, my face betraying nothing, but inside the words echoed with bitter comedy. He truly believed I was the one who needed him, when in truth, it had always been the reverse. That discovery did not ignite rage in me. It ignited resolve. For the first time, I understood that the game had already shifted, that his arrogance was not invincible, but fragile, and that I held in my hands the simplest key to undo it. The night passed in laughter that wasn't mine, in boasts that weren't earned, in plans that would never come to fruition, and I, sitting across from him, remained silent and composed, knowing that soon his financial arrogance, the very pillar of his identity, would be dismantled piece by piece until he stood before the world stripped of everything he believed made him powerful. Replaceable? He would learn soon enough that the only thing replaceable in this relationship was his illusion of control. There comes a moment, after betrayal has stripped away all pretense, when clarity sharpens into something almost surgical. By the time I sat across from him at yet another dinner where his words floated above the table like empty balloons, I was no longer wrestling with disbelief or grief. Those emotions had already hardened into resolve, into a plan I carried like a hidden flame inside me. He continued to talk about ventures and pleasures he had yet to acquire, painting the air with promises meant more for himself than for me, and as he spoke, I envisioned the invisible threads that tied his grandeur together, threads I had woven, threads I could cut. The word he had used, replaceable, was still there, lodged deep in me like a shard of glass, but instead of bleeding, I had learned to hold it, to turn it in my hand until it became a tool. That tool would guide every decision I was about to make. The plan began with silence. Silence was my greatest ally, because he thrived on noise, on the sound of his own voice, on the laughter of those he impressed, on the admiration that followed him when he flashed symbols of wealth. He never noticed silence, never read its depth, never recognized it as strategy. So while I laughed when he made shallow jokes, nodded when he spoke of cars he intended to buy, leaned into him when he touched my arm in public, I was already miles away in my mind, walking through the corridors of financial institutions and legal frameworks. I had prepared for this without even realizing it, years of diligence having left me with maps he had never bothered to look at. I knew where every account rested, where every signature mattered, where every line could be redrawn to shift the balance of power. In the quiet of the night, while he slept soundly beside me, I rose from the bed and padded softly into the adjoining room, the glow of my phone illuminating the path. My attorney had already begun to move the pieces into place after our first conversation, but now it was time to finalize the sequence. Each instruction I gave was calm, precise, and deliberate, my voice betraying none of the storm inside me. Freeze the joint accounts under my authority. Secure the investment portfolios with restrictions requiring dual authorization. Alert the banks of potential fraud so that every transaction would require my explicit approval. It was not enough to simply withdraw. I wanted the entire structure of his access locked in place, the walls closing in on him without him realizing until it was far too late. What struck me most in those moments was how easy it was, how shockingly simple it was to take the empire he believed was his birthright and remind the world, and him, that it had always been sustained by my hand. He had never read the fine print of our agreements, never asked why everything ran smoothly, never suspected that his illusion of independence was scaffolded by my diligence. His ignorance was not merely arrogance, it was opportunity, and I seized it with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose. During the day, I played my part flawlessly. We walked through gardens, swam in the pool, posed for pictures that would later serve as ironic relics of a trip that ended everything. He was oblivious to the fact that each smile I gave was a mask, each gesture a calculated performance to keep him from suspecting the ice forming beneath his feet. I let him hold me in photographs, his arm draped around me like ownership, and I smiled not for the camera, but for the knowledge that soon those images would be all he had left to remind him of the life he thought he controlled. The hardest part was not the planning itself, but the restraint it required. Every time he spoke with casual cruelty, every time he dismissed me with a glance, every time he reveled in his imagined superiority, I wanted to lean across the table and tell him the truth. I wanted to whisper that his empire was already gone, that his arrogance was feeding on borrowed time. But I knew the reveal would only be powerful if it came at the moment he least expected, when his confidence was at its peak and his certainty absolute. So I held my silence, nurtured my plan like a seed growing in the dark, and waited for the perfect moment when the bloom would break through the surface. One night, as he scrolled through his phone and smirked at messages he refused to explain, he turned to me and said, "You don't realize how lucky you are. Most women would kill for this life." The irony of that statement nearly made me laugh aloud, but I caught it in my throat, letting it dissolve into a faint smile. Lucky. Yes, I thought. Lucky that I had built the very life he boasted about. Lucky that I now held the power to take it from him with the stroke of a pen. Lucky that his blindness had given me the sharpest weapon I could have asked for. The plan of freezing was not just financial, it was symbolic. It was about immobilizing the arrogance that had flowed unchecked for too long, about showing him that the freedom he flaunted was an illusion. When the time came, and he reached for the familiar comfort of his wealth, the machine would not respond. The doors would remain locked, the accounts untouchable, the cards silent. And in that moment, stripped of the shield he had always used to disguise his emptiness, he would face the truth that had been waiting for him all along, that the person he had dismissed as replaceable was the very foundation of everything he owned. As I lay beside him the night before the reveal, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I felt a calm unlike anything I had ever known. I did not feel anger, not anymore. I felt inevitability, the weight of justice carried not in fire, but in ice. He slept believing the world was still his, but I knew better. The plan had already been sealed, the locks already turned. By tomorrow, he would no longer be the man who thought himself untouchable. He would be the man who discovered, far too late, what it meant to be truly replaceable. There is always a moment when the cracks begin to show, when the perfect facade starts to betray the truth beneath it. For him, the first sign appeared not as a catastrophic collapse but as a subtle disruption, one so small that another man might have noticed, might have sensed the shift in the air. But arrogance breeds blindness, and his arrogance was a fortress he mistook for safety. The morning after I had set everything in motion, we went down to the resort cafe for breakfast. The waiter approached with his practiced smile and asked if we would like to charge the meal to the room or pay directly. Without hesitation, he reached for his card, that black rectangle he loved to display as though it were proof of his superiority, a talisman he believed shielded him from inconvenience. The waiter swiped it once, then again, his expression faltering only slightly before he offered an apology and explained that the transaction could not be processed. For an instant, I watched his face stiffen, the edges of composure tightening like strings pulled taut. He cleared his throat, smirked as though the inconvenience were beneath him, and waved the waiter off before handing over another card. This one worked, and the moment passed, smoothed over with a dismissive chuckle and a muttered complaint about the incompetence of banks. But I saw it, the flicker of unease in his eyes, quickly buried beneath layers of denial. It was the first sign, and he ignored it, choosing to believe the world was still his to command. That was the beauty of arrogance. It convinces you that reality must always bend in your favor, even when reality has already shifted against you. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the spoon circle the porcelain, my expression soft and indifferent. Inside, however, I savored the sight. Not the humiliation. Not yet. That would come later. But the seed of doubt planted in him, the tiny fracture in his certainty. I knew it would gnaw at him even if he pretended otherwise. He would tell himself stories about system errors, about temporary glitches, about anything other than the truth. Because to face the truth would mean acknowledging that he was no longer invincible, and he was not ready for that. Not yet. The rest of the day, He carried himself with even greater swagger, as though overcompensating for the crack he refused to admit. He tipped excessively at the bar, flashed his watch at strangers, spoke loudly about his business ventures to anyone who would listen. It was all performance, a desperate reinforcement of the illusion he had built around himself. But behind the performance, I could see the questions beginning to take shape. Twice I caught him checking his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, scrolling through his banking app with a frown that quickly smoothed into indifference when he noticed me watching. He never said anything about it, never asked if I knew what was happening, because in his mind, I was still the woman who would never challenge him. His mistake was not just underestimating me, it was believing that silence meant ignorance. That evening, as we dressed for dinner, he made a passing remark about how banks really need to get their act together, and laughed as though the morning's incident had been nothing more than an inconvenience. I smiled, adjusted my earrings in the mirror, and told him he was right, that these things happened all the time. My voice was calm, steady, even supportive, because I wanted him to believe I was still on his side, still blind to the storm he had unknowingly stepped into. He kissed me on the cheek and left for the restaurant as though the world had conspired in his favor once more, and I followed, my mask intact. The truth, however, was that the walls were already closing in. The systems I had locked were working exactly as they were designed to, and soon the fractures would widen until no amount of arrogance could conceal them. But for now, I let him ignore the first sign. I let him believe the story he needed to tell himself, because when the collapse finally came, it would be all the more devastating for having been preceded by such confidence. He thought he was untouchable, thought the world still bent to his whims, and so he dismissed the tremor under his feet. And I, sitting silently across from him, let him dismiss it, knowing that tomorrow, the tremor would become an earthquake. As I lay beside him that night, listening to him boast on the phone to a friend about deals he intended to close, I closed my eyes and let the calm wash over me. He had ignored the first sign, and in doing so, he had set himself up for the fall. Soon, very soon, the life he had built on arrogance and carelessness would reveal itself for what it truly was, fragile, dependent, already gone. And when that happened, he would look back on this morning at the cafe, on the card that was declined and the waiter's apologetic glance, and he would realize too late that it had been the beginning of his end. It was almost poetic how the moment arrived, as if fate itself had conspired to script the downfall, with a sense of irony so sharp it bordered on cruel. We had spent the evening in one of the resort's most luxurious restaurants, a place he had chosen not for the quality of its food, but for the exclusivity of its reputation. The kind of place where chandeliers spilled light across polished floors, where the air carried the faintest scent of truffle and aged wine, where every guest dressed not to eat but to be seen. He adored environments like this, the stages where he could play the role of the successful man, the enviable fiancé, the one who had it all. I sat across from him as he played his part with effortless arrogance, ordering bottles of wine priced higher than most people's monthly rent, choosing courses with a flourish that suggested familiarity, nodding to the waiter as though he were a king dispensing commands to loyal subjects. I smiled when he wanted me to smile, laughed when he tossed casual remarks meant to remind the world how secure he was, and all the while, I kept my silence. The seed planted days earlier had now taken root, and I could almost hear the creak of the walls tightening around him. When the meal ended, decadent, excessive, and unnecessarily drawn out, he leaned back in his chair with the smug satisfaction of a man convinced that life would always serve him what he demanded. The waiter returned, presented the leather-bound bill with a subtle bow, and stood patiently while my fiancé, with the flourish of ritual, produced his card. He slid it across the table with a smile that was more performance than habit. The waiter disappeared with it, and for a brief moment, the illusion still held. But then I watched the shift, subtle at first, the waiter's polite smile dimming as he returned, the card in his hand, his voice soft but unyielding as he explained that the payment could not be processed. My fiancé blinked, confused for only a heartbeat before his arrogance rushed back to the surface. He laughed, shook his head, assured the man it was merely a system error, and handed him another card. The second card failed as well. I will never forget the way his face changed in that instant. The composure slipped, just barely, like a mask beginning to crack. He cleared his throat, muttered something about international travel, about banks tightening security when they shouldn't, and reached for a third card. By then, the waiter's expression had shifted from polite professionalism to the faintest trace of discomfort, the kind that comes when you are forced to witness someone unravel in public. Around us, other guests glanced discreetly, sensing that something unscripted was happening, and my fiancé, desperate to keep control of the narrative, snapped at the waiter to run it again. But the machine was not broken. The decline was real. I watched it all in silence, my expression serene, my eyes calm. Inside, there was no joy, no gloating, just the steady beat of inevitability. This was the moment I had prepared for, the hour of truth when his illusion would shatter not in private, but under the eyes of strangers who had once been his imagined audience of admiration. He leaned forward, his voice low and tense, demanding explanations, but no explanation could save him. The fortress of arrogance he had built around himself was crumbling brick by brick, each decline a hammer blow echoing in the vaulted ceiling of that restaurant. Finally, with hands that trembled just enough for me to notice, he turned to me. There it was, the look he had never worn before in all our years together. Not superiority, not condescension, not even indifference. It was uncertainty, raw and unmasked. He searched my face for reassurance, for the silent support I had always given, for the quiet partner who would step in and rescue him without a word. And for a moment, I let him believe I might. I reached calmly into my purse, not with urgency, but with deliberate grace, and handed the waiter a card of my own. It cleared without hesitation. The bill was paid, the embarrassment softened but not erased, and the whispers that had begun among the other diners lingered like smoke in the air. He exhaled, forced a laugh, muttered excuses about banks and mistakes, but his eyes flickered with something else now. Doubt. He could not admit it aloud. Not yet. But he had felt the tremor beneath his feet, had seen the first true glimpse of the collapse waiting for him. I gave him a smile, gentle, almost pitying, and said nothing. That was the cruelty of silence. It allowed him to imagine, to fear, to question, without ever giving him the comfort of certainty. When we left the restaurant, the night air was cooler than before, heavy with the scent of salt and distant rain. He walked beside me, his steps quicker, his silence louder than any words. I knew he was already replaying the evening in his mind, searching for explanations that would preserve his pride. But there were none. His empire had begun to collapse, and though he tried to stand tall, his shadow betrayed the fracture. That night, as he lay beside me, restless, I stared at the ceiling and listened to his breath uneven with unspoken panic. He would never say it aloud, not then, but I knew the question already gnawed at him. Had I done something? Had I known? Could I be the reason his cards had failed? He would bury the thought beneath layers of denial, telling himself stories of banks and errors, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. And as I drifted into sleep, calm and untroubled, I understood that this was only the beginning. The hour of the bill had been the strike of the clock, and from now on, every minute would draw him closer to the realization he had feared all along, that the woman he had called replaceable was the one who had always held his world together, and that without her, he was nothing more than a man with declined cards and empty promises. The night after the restaurant unfolded in silence so thick it seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the room, clinging to the curtains, the sheets, the very air between us. He had tried, in the moments after his humiliation, to reclaim the ease with which he once carried himself. He had spoken with forced levity, his voice brittle, his laughter hollow, but every word fell like glass breaking against stone. He did not fool me. He did not fool himself either. The arrogance that once radiated from him like an unshakable armor now trembled beneath the weight of a truth he could not name. When we returned to our suite, he moved restlessly through the space, pouring himself drinks he didn't finish, pacing near the balcony, pulling out his phone only to lock it again with impatient swipes of his thumb. I remained composed, sitting quietly on the edge of the bed, brushing my hair with long, steady strokes, as if nothing at all had shifted, though I knew everything had. He wanted me to speak. I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on me, searching for the reassurance I had always given so freely before. He wanted me to tell him it was just a mistake, that banks made errors, that tomorrow everything would return to normal, but I had no intention of saving him this time. Instead, I let the silence stretch, taut and unrelenting, until he finally broke it himself with a muttered complaint. "These damn systems," he said, almost to himself, his voice heavy with irritation. I did not answer. I simply set down the brush, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at him, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a calm so cold it must have unsettled him more than any outburst could have. That look, silent, unwavering, was my confrontation. He was accustomed to words, to debates, to arguments he could twist and win with his charm, but silence gave him no foothold. In silence, I became an impenetrable mirror, reflecting back his own uncertainty, forcing him to confront the possibility that I knew more than I let on. He asked questions, tentative at first. Did I think it was unusual? Did I think he should call the bank? Did I notice how strange it was that all his cards failed? I answered only with shrugs, with soft hums, with indifference so sharp it sliced through his attempts at control. The more he searched my face, the more he realized that I was not panicked, that I was not unsettled. And that, I think, was when the first true fear gripped him. Because if I was calm, it meant I understood something he did not. The hours passed slowly. He drank more, his frustration seeping through the cracks in his composure. At one point he snapped at me, accusing me of looking smug, of enjoying his discomfort. I met his anger with the same coolness, a tilt of my head, a faint smile that said nothing and everything at once. "You're imagining things," I replied softly, my tone devoid of heat, and returned my gaze to the book in my lap, though I barely registered the words on the page. It was not the content of the book that mattered, but the act of reading itself, the demonstration that his unraveling was not enough to shake me from my peace. He slammed his glass down on the table, muttered curses under his breath, but he could not draw me into his storm. My silence was absolute, and in that silence he floundered. By the time he finally collapsed into bed, restless and uneasy, I lay beside him without touching him, my body angled away, my breath even and steady. He tossed and turned, murmuring half-formed words in his sleep, the tension of the evening bleeding into his dreams. And though I did not close my eyes for hours, I felt no exhaustion, only the clarity of someone who had stepped into her power completely. He had called me replaceable, and now, in the cold aftermath of his public decline, he was the one clinging to me, silently begging for comfort I refused to provide. The next morning, his attempts at conversation were stilted, his voice lower, stripped of its usual confidence. He asked if I had slept well, if I wanted to spend the day at the pool, if I thought he should call the bank again. I answered politely, evenly, but without the warmth he craved. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The balance of power had changed. No longer was I the one orbiting his world. He was the one orbiting mine, desperate to know what I was thinking, desperate for signs that his empire was not crumbling as quickly as it felt. And still, I gave him nothing. That was the confrontation, not in words or shouts or accusations, but in silence that forced him to feel the absence of control. Silence that revealed itself as strength, while his arrogance revealed itself as fragility. Silence that turned his own question back on him without me ever needing to ask it aloud. If I was so replaceable, why did he suddenly look so afraid of losing me? As we walked together through the resort later that day, his hand brushed mine more often than before, seeking a connection he once took for granted. I allowed it, but did not return the pressure. My composure was unbreakable, my mask flawless, and in that quiet, I saw him begin to fracture. He had not yet fully realized that his financial collapse was complete, but he sensed it. He sensed me. And though he would not admit it, he knew in his bones that something had shifted irreversibly, that the woman he dismissed so carelessly had become the silent architect of his ruin. And I knew, as I watched the unease deepen in his eyes, that the next stage would arrive soon. The final reveal was coming, inevitable as the tide, and when it did, the man who had once boasted of being untouchable would stand stripped bare. The silent confrontation had already broken him in ways words never could. All that remained was the collapse, public and undeniable, when he would finally understand who was truly replaceable. The end did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic collapse, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide that had been pulling back all along, preparing for the moment it would surge forward and wash everything away. By the time our trip concluded, he was a shadow of the man who had strutted into the resort days earlier, brimming with arrogance, speaking of wealth as though it were an inheritance of the gods. The failed cards, the whispers in the restaurant, the silence I had wielded like a blade. They had all carved at his confidence until little remained but the husk of a man pacing at the edges of his own panic. He no longer made boasts about ventures or cars, no longer laughed too loudly to remind the world of his importance. Instead, he stared at his phone obsessively, refreshing screens that gave him no comfort, calling banks that confirmed his access had been restricted, muttering curses under his breath when each conversation ended the same. He did not know how it had happened, only that it had, and in his refusal to admit the obvious, he turned his suspicion inward, glancing at me with a mixture of need and unease. When the car arrived to take us to the airport, he climbed into it with the weariness of someone twice his age, his jaw tight, his silence oppressive. I sat beside him, my gaze fixed on the road, the palms rushing past, the horizon opening like a promise. He wanted to speak, I could feel it, but the words never left his lips. Perhaps he was waiting for me to break first, to explain, to comfort, to reassure him that this was all temporary, but I had no interest in offering him that gift. He had forfeited it the moment he told me I was replaceable. That single word had written his fate, and now he was living it in real time, stripped of the illusions that had once made him believe he was untouchable. On the plane, as the engines hummed and the world below shrank into patterns of blue and green, I closed my eyes and let the calm settle over me. I thought of the years I had given him, the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had reshaped to fit into his ambitions, and I realized how light I felt, without them weighing me down. Betrayal had not broken me. It had liberated me. His cruelty had not diminished my worth. It had sharpened my resolve. I had discovered in the quiet planning of his ruin a strength I had not known I carried. And as he sat beside me, restless, fidgeting, unable to find peace, I knew that strength would remain long after he was gone. When we landed, reality struck him with the blunt force of inevitability. His accounts were still frozen, his calls unanswered, his cards rejected one after another as he tried to navigate the terminal with the bravado of a man who could not accept defeat. I watched him struggle, watched him falter, watched him realize that the life he thought he owned had been built on foundations he never understood. He turned to me once, his eyes sharp with accusation, but even then he could not say the words aloud. To accuse me would have been to acknowledge my power, and he could never do that. Instead, he swallowed his pride and walked ahead, his shoulders hunched, his confidence shattered. I, however, walked with my head high. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of his shadow lift from me. I was no longer the woman waiting for him, no longer the partner bending to his will, no longer the silent caretaker of his empire. I was something entirely new, free, unburdened, whole. The word he had used against me no longer wounded me. Replaceable. Yes, I thought, smiling faintly to myself as I handed my passport to the officer. One of us had been replaceable all along, but it wasn't me. In the weeks that followed, the collapse unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. His friends distanced themselves when the truth became impossible to deny. His ventures crumbled without the capital he had so carelessly assumed would always be there, and the whispers that once celebrated his wealth turned into murmurs of mockery. He called me at first, demanding explanations, then pleading for forgiveness, and finally, in the silence that followed, disappearing into the obscurity he had always feared. I did not answer. I did not need to. My silence was the only response he deserved, the final reminder that I was no longer bound by him, no longer willing to carry the weight of his arrogance. And so my life began again. Not with grand declarations or dramatic reinventions, but with the simple joy of living on my own terms. I pursued the dreams I had shelved, reconnected with parts of myself I had neglected, discovered passions and freedoms I had long forgotten. Each step was a reminder that betrayal was not the end of my story, but the beginning of a truer one. I was not replaceable. I was resilient. And he, so convinced of his invincibility, was the one who faded, the one who proved himself interchangeable, the one who left no mark worth remembering. As I stood one evening on the balcony of my new home, the air cool against my skin, the city lights flickering like stars below, I whispered the words he had once thrown at me with such carelessness. Replaceable, I said softly, and this time I smiled, because I knew, finally and irrevocably, who the word belonged to.